This week on Quadriga, international turmoil, new world disorder. Russia's annexation of Crimea has shaken the international community. The European Union and the United States have stressed they are united over the crisis and are threatening economic sanctions against Moscow. The G8 group of major economies has suspended Russia, and NATO has issued reassurances that it is ready to protect its eastern members. Even countries such as China appear to be reconsidering their approach to Putin's Russia. The world once hoped that Russia was becoming an increasingly reliable partner. But since the Ukraine crisis, that hope has been replaced by anxiety about a new Cold War. Your host this week, Ali Aslan.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Russia's annexation of Crimea has the potential to plunge the international community into a long-standing conflict. What then are the global and wider ramifications of this Crimean conflict? To help us answer this and many more questions, I am joined by three experts, all who've been following events in Crimea very closely. Welcome to Michael Stürmer, who's the senior correspondent at the German daily Die Welt. He is a renowned historian and has written extensively on Russia and Eastern Europe. Ramesh Jaura is the global editor of the news analysis service IDN-InDepthNews, as well as Global Perspectives, a magazine for international cooperation. He's also a co-founder and executive president of the Global Cooperation Council, a think tank devoted to fair globalization and global security. And Judy Dempsey, who's currently a non-resident senior associate at Carnegie Europe and the editor-in-chief of the blog Strategic Europe. Previously, she reported on Central and Eastern Europe for the International Herald Tribune, The Economist, and the Financial Times. Welcome to all of you on today's show. A lot to talk about, so let's get right to it, Judy Dempsey. Ironically, this conflict, Russia's annexation of Crimea, seems to have a positive impact on transatlantic relations. President Obama just visited Brussels and met with his EU counterparts. Now, the transatlantic relations, as we know, went through somewhat of a recent hiccups due to the NSA crisis and so on and so forth. But they've come together in light of this Crimean conflict, haven't they?
Well, I wonder, have they, in fact? Certainly on paper, there's lots of smiles and lots of nice rhetoric and lots of nice words. But actually, there's three major weaknesses in the transatlantic relationship. One is that Europe and the United States are not at one in terms of how to deal with Russia. Washington has imposed tough sanctions, and indeed Washington has made all the running with the sanctions. The Europeans are quite ambiguous about going on to phase 2 and phase 3 of the sanctions. That's the first thing. Secondly, there's lots of disunity inside NATO as to how NATO should respond and what kind of measures they will do to enhance the security of the Baltic states and Poland. And the third thing is much more fundamental, much more in the long term. How on earth are the Europeans and Americans going to get the big trade investment partnership off the ground? These are three big issues. Big issues indeed, but Michael Stürmer, President Obama seems to remember, if you will, in some respects, who his allies are, who his friends are in light of this crisis, in his efforts to isolate Russia internationally. Do you think this will have an impact, long-standing impact, on the transatlantic relations?
Well, that's the law of unintended consequences that Vladimir Putin has to acknowledge. And the price for Crimea can be very high. How high, we haven't yet decided. And it's easy to get into sanctions and very difficult to declare not victory but compromise. Where do we want to be in a few months' time, or God forbid, in a few years' time? Where do we want to be? What is our... When can we say this is an equitable outcome? Some voices, and I find them very worrying indeed, talk about NATO extension to Ukraine. I think it's utter madness. We should analyze how we got into this crisis very carefully And it's not all the blame on Putin's side and all the virtue on the Western side. I think that we have treated Russia as a weak, passive, spent force, not taking any notice of sort of legitimate interests of Russia. And I'm not the only one to say so. I take notice of the fact that Brzezinski says exactly the same thing. Henry Kissinger say the same thing.
Do I understand you correctly then if you say the Europeans or the Western world is to blame for the Crimean conflict?
No, not to blame, but we've contributed. We went sleepwalking is the 2014 term, sleepwalking into a crisis of which neither the EU Commission had the slightest idea, nor did Putin have a master plan to cash in. It came while we were going on and on and on, congratulating ourselves about the great Western message to the 19th century power. Well, this is terrible arrogance coupled with ignorance, because the rules of politics are as old as history, and they weren't invented yesterday in Washington, D.C. So I think it's a fairly complicated thing, and I think the Russia bashing is well deserved, but there should be some self-examination on the part of Europe and Germany and others. Germany is least to blame. Angela Merkel knows a lot about Russia and the Russians.
And the self-examination on the part of the Europeans, Ramesh Jaura, is or may not be ongoing. But let's pick up on the issue that Michael Stürmer put forth, namely that we have perhaps in the West and in Europe underestimated our own course of actions. President Vladimir Putin has said many times that the NATO membership action plan, for instance, is a threat to Russian national security, meaning NATO is coming closer to our borders and we will have to react. Do you think he has a point? Do you think Vladimir Putin has a point?
Well, certainly. What we are seeing now is actually the new great game of the 19th century. That time it was Britain and Russia, and now it is the West. If you club all the West together, the West European countries, some former East European countries, plus the United States. And I mean, looking back at history, we had the first Crimean War. That was 160 years ago. Then the Tsar wanted to protect the Orthodox Russians in Crimea and against the Muslim Ottomans. Putin says he wants to protect Russians against the fascist Ukrainians. So it's a kind of a old game, great game, which is continuing in a different kind of version. On the other hand, I think if transatlantic relations are only dependent on the threat, maybe a perceived threat, real or perceived, from Russia, then I don't think there's something well at work. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. And the third point I would like to make is that we shouldn't forget, as Michael Stürmer said, we treated, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union into several states, we went on thrashing the wounded Russian bear. We did not take into account how it looks like if, when you were strong and musculous and now you're lying on the ground, you don't keep on hitting. You know?
Well, I slightly beg to differ on that. In fact, it is quite remarkable that Russia did join the group of 7 industrial countries, becoming the 8th, and they finally did the WTO negotiations. I mean, the international order was open to Russia. I mean, nobody wants a hurt Russia or an insecure Russia or Russia with an inferiority complex. That's the first point. But the second point is this propaganda from Russia that the Russians living outside the Russian Federation are under threat. And there's an open letter in today's New York Times from the Ukrainian Jews and there's a thriving community there, criticising Putin for using such nasty language and saying that the Ukrainians are persecuting the Russians. And this community said this is simply not true. And this is a kind of propaganda which is very, very dangerous for other ethnic groups as well, Russian and non-Russian, living in the former republics of the Soviet Union. And if Putin's going to use this kind of propaganda, where will it end?
And where will it end? Indeed, this is one of the main questions we will ask. But Michael Stürmer, let's look at what the US and the EU have used as a tool to respond to Russia's annexation of Crimea. For one, asset freezes and travel bans of high-ranking Russian officials, and also the expelling Russia from the G8, now making it more or less de facto the G7. Is that an effective move?
No. The short answer is no. I think disinviting Russia from a very potentially very important club, is disingenuous. Because that's where you can talk and say, Vladimir, you went too far. We understand you have concerns, but calm down and we'll find a fix. And we understand that Ukraine, you have to understand that Ukraine is not part of Russia, and we understand that you want a kind of special relationship because of culture and religion and 1,000 other things. That would have been my proposition. If I had to advise the Chancellor, I would have said, this is how you save us all from a major crisis continuing to develop at high speed.
So an ineffective course of action then?
Pinpricks.
Ramesh Jaura?
You see, I think basic issue is that we are bogged down in what I would call a culture of conflict, if not a culture of war. What we need is a culture of peace. And that involves dialogue, especially when it is tough times, we have to talk to people. You know, in Germany, you call it Wandel durch Annäherung. That was the policy during the height of the Cold War, bringing about change by talking to people. Dialogue has to be the crux of the whole policy that one adopts. Now, going back, of course, there are always, in conflictive situations, the subjective truths, they tend to bloat themselves, and that results in greater conflicts. If I remember, I was at the the G8 meeting in Munich when Yeltsin was brought into the G7. You see, let's not forget it, that the West, and I mean, it's of course the legitimate right of the West to try to exploit a weak situation in Russia. When Yeltsin came, I mean, we know he was a drunkard, and West wanted to make the best use of his lack of stability and lack of composure, and they brought him in. But Putin is a different kind of person. I mean, we know Putin's background. So we cannot say that West has always been very sincere about harvesting what one would have expected, a peace dividend. There was no earnest attempt to harvest a peace dividend.
Well, I beg to differ. I mean, 3 years ago at the Munich Security Conference, they did the big. There was an agreement to reduce nuclear weapons. I mean, there has been progress on the nuclear weapon front. This has been so important, and in Ukraine as well, and in Kazakhstan, this has been a major breakthrough of the post-Cold War era. We can't forget this. As regards Putin himself, I must say, I think the successive German chancellors have gone out of their way to try to have a relationship with Russia. And the modernization plan partnership, which since Merkel came to office since 2005, they did persist with it. They really believed that through economic modernization, a partnership helped gradually the political system might open up. It hasn't happened. And so you can't bash the West for not trying, because I really do believe that Germany did try, and I think there's a huge sense of disappointment now among the political elite that this kind of special policy hasn't led to the results that Berlin wanted, and indeed that some of the political elites in Russia wanted.
Do you think Germany is a bit special in the West? And
of course, Germany is special. This is now changing, indeed, how we have seen Chancellor Merkel deal with Putin. But I think you're absolutely right that at the end of the day, there has to be a dialogue. I mean, cutting off dialogue radicalizes the situation.
At the end of the day, why
Okay,
not
but now
before? Why not back-channel diplomacy? Why not all these services?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, the NSA knows exactly what the Russians are talking about. The Russian services know exactly what the Americans and we are talking about if they are interested. So there needs a lot of communication being activated.
Yes.
Dialogue from the start. You don't need to establish dialogue with friends. You have to establish dialogue with competitors.
I agree with this, and I think one of the big problems facing us, even as we speak now, is that the longer we postpone a dialogue, even on the back channels, the more radicalized both sides become, or the more set in their ways, because there are a group of European countries that want to dig in and want to be much tougher, and this is actually quite dangerous.
What strikes me, one of the few things that President Obama said during his speeches both in The Hague and Brussels, said that the annexation of Crimea is not a done deal, it's not set in stone, because it lacks the international legitimacy. Russia, and especially Putin, has come a bit too far now to turn back, hasn't he?
I don't know how far President Obama is right. Of course, he has to say that. Again, let's go back to history.
And he's a law professor.
Pardon?
He's a law professor.
Okay, fine.
but is there any circumstance that any of you foresee that Putin would abandon Crimea after annexing it in the first place?
May I just interject? See, let's go back to history a little bit. 1950, the People's Republic of China, it took over Tibet. There was a hue and cry, and there's still hue and cry. So where is the suzerainty of Tibet? There's nowhere there. The Indian troops had to march into Goa because the Portuguese refused to follow the British and say, okay, Goa is a part of India. So they had to march in to take over Goa. Some countries in the West made a hue and cry, but it's become a part and parcel of the Indian state. It hasn't happened in Kashmir, which is a very conflictive situation for the last 60 years now, because there are 3 Kashmirs, one under Indian control, the other under Pakistani control, the third one under the Chinese control. Besides, the 3 of them have nuclear weapons. Now, some of the people today, they are saying, well, if Ukraine had not abandoned the nuclear weapons, Russians would never have dared to take over Crimea. And even my friend Ban Ki-moon says, we have to be very careful that people do not stop giving up nuclear weapons if situations like this arise. I mean, I find it shameful for the UN Secretary General to talk about this. In other words, he's saying, keep your nuclear weapons, otherwise the world will collapse. So there's a lot of confusion. So we are in a state of disorder in a world which was supposed to have become more orderly, more peaceful, harvesting the dividend of peace. So we have to speak. We have to speak to each other, and that's the only way out. If we don't, then there will be vested interests on both sides who would like to escalate the situation, make it more serious, and that would mean a military conflict. Of course, and I don't think there'll be a third world war, but any kind of conflict that takes place is a shame for the 21st century, for the political leadership of the 21st century. So everything must be done to come to a peaceful solution.
And a peaceful solution everyone is seeking, and one country in particular might play a very crucial role here, a country that hasn't been much heard from during the course of the Crimean annexation, namely China. What is China's position? What is Beijing's position vis-à-vis Russia's annexation of Crimea? Let's have a quick look.
Xi Jinping visiting a medical research laboratory in France this week. The Chinese president's first state tour of Europe is a demonstration that China's economic links with countries around the world are becoming more intense. And Beijing's response to the Ukraine crisis may be a sign that its trade interests are causing a change in its foreign policy too. In In recent years, China has signed major deals to buy Ukrainian wheat, an essential source of food for its vast population. And Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, which have traditionally been part of Russia's sphere of influence, are increasingly exporting their energy to China. China's decision not to back Russia over Crimea in the UN Security Council might be a hint that Beijing's sense of its international role is changing. In previous votes, the Chinese government always tended to support its huge northern neighbour.
Well, Judy Dempsey, we just saw that China abstained in the UN security vote on Crimea. There were various interpretations of this. Some said this is actually in favor of Russia, in favor of Moscow. Some said, no, this is a slap in the face of Putin. What do you make of it?
I think it's a warning to Russia that, China is very uncomfortable with what Putin did in Crimea, because China has its own territorial issues as well. Just look around and its relations with Japan, for instance, and not to mention Tibet, not to mention Taipei. There's quite a number of outstanding issues. And a land grab is certainly not what China would support. Abstention, I think, was a signal to Russia. I think you've gone too far. It wouldn't clearly veto, but this was, or support it, but I think this was quite a shift for China. This is the first point. Secondly, Russia is important for China, but China has so many other bigger countries to think about economically. We have to think of Africa, but particularly Europe and the United States. So I think China is seriously looking at its short-term and long-term strategic interests that may actually go beyond Russia.
And Michael Stürmer, President Obama and Chinese President Xi Jinping talked about a new major power relationship in The Hague. Are we seeing a new alliance emerging out of this Crimean conflict? The new Beijing-Washington alliance?
So far. This carries us back to the Nixon-Mao triangle with Brezhnev in the Kremlin not looking very intelligently. So the interesting thing is whether China abstained or not. Wasn't all that important. Russia was totally isolated. That was the real fact. And no China came to the help of poor old Russia, which had mismanaged a very major crisis. And that's the fact to remember. And when the Chinese leaders now in Berlin, this will be high on the agenda to understand what is going on. There are some tectonic changes taking place. And China, of course, doesn't want to be taken for a ride by Putin. This is adventurism in Chinese eyes. China goes for the long term. Putin stumbled into this crisis. There is no master plan for the crisis. There was no master plan. Of course, Putin wants to reconstruct somehow the imperial space, which doesn't mean annexing everybody around. He is afraid of color revolutions. He has a trauma of color revolutions. This is not what you have learned to like when you have a KGB background. So when he saw 2004, it was a personal crisis for his leadership. And only because the various intelligence services in Russia, secret services in Russia, couldn't agree on a replacement. That's what saved him. That's why he came out triumphantly. So the Chinese mindset is a global one, and the Chinese see that in a global context, and then Europe, America, Germany are very important. Yeah. Putin sees the crisis as something on the margins of Russia, which he thinks is a legitimate target for his policies. And we all hope that it's the last target. And China has to play a major role in this. And indeed, Ramesh Jaura, China is famous, Beijing is famous for its emphasis on the policy of non-interference in other nations' affairs.
Not always.
At least verbally. This is what Beijing always resorts to when it's being asked to take a position, for instance, in the Crimean conflict. How do you think this will play out on the Chinese front?
I would agree that China has a long-term policy, and in the Soviet days, one used to say that the Soviets have a long-term policy as opposed to the West. I don't know how far that was correct. If that was correct, then we wouldn't have seen the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and we wouldn't have seen nothing happening out of the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Chinese, I mean, it's the largest populated country in the world. It has huge resources, and the Chinese have their strong national pride, and there are different ethnic communities in China. I mean, there are Muslims in China, there are Christians in China. And so China has to be extremely careful in whatever it does when it comes to the international scene. And I think China finds itself right now in a much stronger position than Russia does, because it's also psychological reasons. China has not dissolved as a state. The Soviet Union has dissolved as a state. And this leaves a very deep impact on the mind. And I would think that apart from the Secret Service background, KGB background of Putin, he is not in a position to look beyond today. He thinks he should avail of an opportunity which is there, and he doesn't think either what consequences it might have if he does not get away from this course. But I think that in Russia too, there are intelligent foreign policy makers, and they would not let things go as far as that. But I think West has to be very, very careful. You know, there's a G20, and Australia has already come up with a suggestion with the G20, get Russia out of this, which is absolutely nonsense. Because if you have Russia out of G8, fine. I mean, it doesn't change the world. But G20, or BRICS for that matter, you cannot take Russia out. So that's where Australians, or those who's supposed to be pursuing the policy of the so-called West, they make a big mistake if they make such moves.
Ramesh Jaura, you've made a very interesting point about the existence of bright, smart foreign policy experts in Russia. But when people, television presenters or journalists or experts do speak out against Putin's move of Crimea, they're sacked from the Academy of Science, from radio, from the television. So, I mean, if Putin, as you say, is not thinking in the long term, it's a short term, well, the effect of this policy, I think, will only change from within.
Yeah.
If we continue pushing Putin up against a wall, so to speak, what is left but the internal dynamics of Russian society? And I think it's too early to say this, but we mustn't forget that 50,000 people in Moscow took to the streets 2 weeks ago. There was an immense courageous act against what Putin was doing in Crimea and Ukraine. They were standing up for something essential, something that we forget is part of this crisis: human rights, freedom of expression, to have a strong civil society and accountable structures. That's an underlying, hugely complex problem now taking place in Russia and indeed Ukraine. We haven't seen the end of this by any stretch of the imagination.
And there are, of course, various other international conflicts that are directly or indirectly impacted by the annexation of Crimea. Let's talk about Syria here. President Assad, by all accounts, perhaps one of the individuals profiting from the Crimean conflict, because the focus has been shifted very much away from Syria, hasn't it, Michael Stürmer?
Well, PR-wise, it's a blessing for Assad, what has happened. And also, not only PR-wise, but also in terms of realpolitik, Assad gets probably more support from Russia. And what worries the Israelis, and I think rightly so, is that there may be very sophisticated weaponry now on its way, which could be a game changer in the Middle East, far beyond the Golan Heights and the Hezbollah territory in southern Lebanon. this is beginning to have global consequences. There is no such thing as a regional crisis anymore. It is long gone beyond that point.
Yes, I completely agree with you, Michael Stürmer. But Assad is in a very strong position now, and we have seen that the diplomatic efforts have gone nowhere. And and what is interesting is that if how this will affect Putin's relationship with Syria and indeed with Iran, because I mean, there's no doubt that Washington and the Europeans have needed Russia to go along with this whole complex deal with Iran. Is this now going to fall apart, or will Putin sort of allow Iran to now even boost its support of Hezbollah and feed in more weapons into Syria? This is unbelievably dangerous, what's happening.
And it's not a single-issue crisis. This is a complex crisis, as Judy said.
And Turkey, another country that is watching from the sidelines, has a historic relations to the Muslim and Turkic community of the Tatar community in Crimea. Turkey, of course, has its own set of internal problems these days, but it's watching closely. Very much so. And I mean, Turkey has had, under Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan, has a very hot and cold relationship with Putin and indeed with the Iranians and the Middle East. And now we've seen, precisely because the international spotlight was on Crimea, we've seen Erdogan, who's having huge domestic problems over corruption and other issues, escalating a conflict with Syria, which he can ill afford actually to have. The spillover is it's not only dangerous, the region, Middle East, is even more combustible. And one little footnote, unfortunately, I hope it won't be turn into a huge one, is the Caucasus. I mean, what Putin has done in Crimea may actually ignite what the Caucasus, which is so unstable at the moment. And the West cannot afford to keep its eye just on Putin. They need Putin to actually consider the long-term ramifications of what he has done, but also the international community's responsibility and awareness of what's happening in their own neighbourhood. It's actually got worse over the past couple of months. Ramesh Jaura, de-escalation is what you set forth as a very imminent step to solve this crisis. What would a face-saving option look like for President Putin? How could he get out of this mess and please the international community? It's a million-dollar question, of course.
Well, as Judy said, it has to come from within Russia. And I'm quite optimistic that things will change as the pressure mounts within Russia itself. It's a land not only of Marx and Lenin. Marx was a British guy, but it's not a land of Lenin and Trotsky. It's also Dostoevsky. So I am quite optimistic that Russians it will take some time. But I think what the West, it's not one homogenic thing, should also take into account is to avail of the channels of communication which exist within the BRICS and within the G20. The Russians have, since the Great Game, they have been very much interested in Asia. And the Black Sea, and through the Black Sea, Bosporus and the Eastern Mediterranean, so you can sidestep the Himalayas. And so that's something we have to keep in mind. And I think there is a great possibility, even India, which has close relations with Russia as it had with the Soviet Union before, for historical and geopolitical reasons, is not very much amused about the accession of Crimea, because it can very well think what it means if Pakistan tomorrow says that Azad Kashmir, the independent Kashmir, is a part of Pakistan.
And indeed, Judy Dempsey, do you think that Putin's attempt to alter recognized borders will open a whole slew of Pandoras Box? Do you think will other nations attempt to do the same, follow him?
Well, the Pandora's Box is certainly open. We just have to look at the instability in Transnistria, which is part of Moldova, but it's Russian-backed. And Russian nationalists have their eye on actually probably annexing this. There's frozen conflicts all over. We've got the Nagorno-Karabakh, we have Transnistria, we have other issues as well. I mean, this is the fear of the Baltic states, that if the so-called West does not recognise, but admit that Crimea is going to remain in Russia, there's a feeling among some Western countries, well, where will Putin stop? That goes back to our initial discussion, you know, how are we going to have a dialogue with Putin? I don't think telephone calls are sufficient. I wonder which leader has actually gone to Moscow and sat down with Putin and said, you know, what do you want to do with this? What's your long-term strategy? Is there an exit strategy or safe phasing for the West and Russia? Then one has to find one.
Is there any circumstance, Michael Stürmer, under which you can envision President Putin becoming once again a reliable partner for the Western world?
Not in the short term. In the long term, what are the options? We have a lot of fish to fry, and we have to do it together, from the spread of nuclear weapons to Syria, to Iran, to global warming. There are major problems. Russia, after all, is the largest country on earth, around the globe. We cannot afford to continuously send Putin into the corner where he has to repent like an ill-advised student. We have to work for that, and we have to, what Kennedy did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we also have to look for face-saving solutions, not only for us, but also for the other side. These are the basic rules of negotiation and international dialogue. The problem is not to love your friends. The problem is to talk to your enemies and come to a common understanding. And that, I think that over the last few months, 2 months, we've moved away from that basic principle. I hope that Angela Merkel keeps away from that thing, but I don't trust the EU bureaucracy. I don't trust the advisors of Obama. He is lecturing like a Harvard professor to an undergraduate, while the situation is terribly complicated. And of course, Putin didn't just march in. He took the trouble of pretending that there was a democratic element. 95% that was, of course, fictitious. But maybe half of the population was really for the annexation. So when we look at the future, we'll see more of that model, this kind of playing with democracy, pretending that it's democratic, not just brute force, but a mix of brute force behind and some more persuasive, acceptable methods, of course, which are tinged through the force in the background.
It is called managed democracy, I think.
Managed democracy.
Yes.
That's a euphemism.
Yes, of course it's a euphemism. One tiny little point on this. We mustn't... you wonder what would bring the Americans or the Europeans and Russia to the negotiating table. Because at the moment, does Vladimir Putin see any interest in it? The opinion polls are soaring in his favour. He's got huge public support for this. And those who were, some critics who were saying, well, I don't like Putin, but they've able to separate their opposition to Putin from their support for what he's done in Crimea. So, I mean, Putin has no reason at the moment to go to the table unless, of course, the Russian economy really suffers as a result of the sanctions.
Well, we know the history of the East-West relations, and particularly Germany's relation with the Soviet Union. So we need people like Egon Bahr. We need Egon Bahrs. Last night there was an interview on the ZDF with the Siemens chief who went to Moscow and also met Putin. He was grilled by our colleague, Mr. Kleber, you know. I mean, it was such an aggressive way of asking him questions. Why did you do that, you know? I mean, this is again a conflictive approach. And so the idea is if a Siemens chief goes there and has an opportunity to talk, and that means economic relations. Economic relations, if you strengthen them, then you will change also Russia from within, because there will be vested interests, there will be stakeholders within the Russia who would not like Putin to go out of control.
But Ramesh, Germany has been pursuing this, trying to pursue this policy for so long. That's the frustrating aspect of it. I mean, Steinmeier's, the foreign minister's speech that he gave at Katharinaburg in 2007, it was an extraordinary speech of not idealism, but, you know, the politics of wish fulfillment. Look, we'll help you, we'll do this, infrastructure, modernization, trains, health, environment, clean water, everything. And they really believed that this would eventually happen. And this kind of Ostpolitik hasn't worked. It did during the Cold War as a dialogue, which was very important. But there's a feeling among many social democrats that they have hit a stone wall as regards this very fundamental policy. And they're not quite sure where to turn now. And that's the worrying thing for them.
Well, I couldn't agree more. But again, we have to start from where do we want to be in 5 years' time or in 2 years' time, and then we have to tackle the crucial question. And one of the crucial questions, Crimea is a done deal. I have no illusions about it. And if Putin were to say tomorrow, oh, I made a mistake, he could not show his face in Moscow streets.
No. Exactly.
That's the trouble.
They will lynch him.
But where do we want to be in 2 or 5 years' time? My answer is work for the Finlandization, and you can arrive at that conclusion for Ukraine. You can arrive on that conclusion only through dialogue and a kind of cutting off the loudspeakers. I
completely disagree. If you go on this point, actually, I should agree with you. Finlandization of Ukraine means that Ukraine joins the EU because Finland is in the EU, and
but not NATO.
Well,
no, that's another story. They're actually negotiating with NATO.
Clearly, so much more to talk about. A fascinating discussion. I want to thank you, and clearly, what has become very clear that this conflict has very wide ramifications on the global stage. I want to thank you out there for tuning in. Thank you again for a very spirited discussion. We'll continue this another time. Looking forward to seeing you again next week for a new edition of Quadriga.